Welcome. Great to see so many people. I know there's a lot happening on campus this evening, so thank you all for joining us. For the keynote lecture of the symposium, Discrepant Circulations. This symposium has been convened by our esteemed and beloved colleague from the History of Art Department on the other side of the elevator shaft, Professor Craig Buckley. Yes, yay, exactly. One of the reasons we love him is because he is a historian of modern architecture, and he teaches courses that are a draw for art history students, Yale College students, and students from the School of Architecture. You have a big fan club here, Craig. So you are, as you could tell from the applause, an admired faculty member, I think a particularly gifted writer, and a good friend. So I want to thank you for all the effort you have put into planning this symposium, and I am going to hand this over to you momentarily. I just want to say, Craig, as you might have guessed, will be actually introducing tonight's speaker. So I won't say any more about that other than to thank Tim for coming to Yale to join us for this exchange of ideas. And I think you all, I hope you will attend the symposium tomorrow in the fourth floor pit under the watchful eyes of our goddess Minerva. Just want to say one other thing, which is the School of Architecture is very happy to co-support this symposium in collaboration with History of Art. And we can do that thanks to the J. Irwin Miller Endowment given to the school by his children to honor their parents' commitment to good design. If you've been to Columbus, Indiana, you know what I'm talking about. So, Craig, the floor is yours, and Tim, thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Deborah, for that really warm welcome and for just immediately supporting this symposium when I floated the idea last year. Thanks also to the History of Art Department, to Millette Geifman, our chair, for supporting the event, and indeed to the Macmillan Center and its Kemp Fund for on-campus convening, who supported this event tremendously. More thanks to AJ, to Richard, to Lena Chen. Where's Lena? Lena, who's been behind the scenes making all this happen. Nicole Chardier in History of Art. All of you have really made this come together. And thank you to everyone for coming tonight and hopefully tomorrow to the symposium, which will be taking place on the fourth floor in the pit. I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to welcome Tim Anstey tonight to open the symposium, Discrepant Circulations. If you'll permit me just to say a few words about the symposium before I introduce Tim. There has, I think, in recent years been a resurgent concern with movement and with mobilities of various kinds in architectural culture. The movement of inhabitants, the movement of laborers, the movements of energy, the movements of materials, the movements of information, of capital. And this symposium is really a modest effort to try and slow down and take some time to think together about one of the terms that we routinely use to make sense of things that move, the term circulation. Circulation is a term we use routinely, yet its meaning is anything but self-evident. The term has a long and complex genealogy, and I won't speak about it tonight. I'll leave that for tomorrow's introduction. But it's most often used as a rough synonym for the flow, passage, dissemination, or transmission of any number of things. What you see on the screen, I think, is good evidence of that. If you spend your time in schools of architecture, you're most likely to use circulation in a way that refers to the passage of people or vehicles through a building or urban complex, or perhaps to the conduits that carry fluids like air or water. The field tends to refer to circulation as a noun, implying that it's a thing. Circulation is something defined by systems that are closed, or at least able to be closed. And this is often how architects are expected to draw it, to model it, to analyze it, to design it. Yet if you spend your time in other parts of the university, say in art history, or in anthropology, or in media studies, just to name a few, circulation carries a different set of meanings. There, circulation pertains to the way that objects, capital, knowledge, or images are transmitted or carried from one place to another. It concerns the processes that move outwards in many different directions and that pertain to the exchange of objects and ideas, together with the ways that these are reshaped and modified by such exchanges. Circulation, in this sense, is less something you design than something you discern. It's a more elusive set of encounters and exchanges that can often be gleaned only from traces found in documents, such as auction records or travel logs, in exhibition histories or ship manifests, in bank records or police files. Circulation, in other words, is a discrepant concept, and that's one of the reasons to choose that term for the title of today's symposium. It's one that points to very different kinds of movement and different ways of thinking about movement. This inconsistency, I hope, will be less a source of confusion than an opportunity for transdisciplinary dialogue. What happens if we try to unlearn the habit of thinking of circulation in reified terms, and instead think more about the tensions that term locates? Tensions between movement and arrest, between passage and capture, between flow and confinement. What the discipline of architecture calls circulation concerns more than ideals of fluid, elegant, and efficient mobility. It also names operations that differentiate, regulate, and channel people and things by means of pathways and diversions, openings and closures. Thinking of circulation as an operational field, we might better focus on those processes that differentiate mobilities by means of social, technical, or aesthetic practices, differences that have always been constituted within unequal relations of power and knowledge. And when I began planning this event a year ago, I couldn't have sensed just how important questions pertaining to the freedom or restriction of circulation would be today. All of which is to say that Tim Anstey is a perfect person to start us off tonight. He's an architect and historian, a graduate of the Architectural Association in London and the School of Architecture at Bath University, where he received his doctorate. He currently directs the PhD program at the Oslo School of Architecture and Design and is a member of the Oslo Center for Critical Architectural Studies. He's the editor of a number of influential collections of essays, including Architecture and Authorship of 2007, Images of Egypt, edited with Mary Lending and Eric Bohn in 2018, and the traveling exhibition and book Warburg Models, Buildings as Bilderfahrzeuge, again edited with Mary Lending. This last project underscores Tim's originality, I think, in exploring questions of movement in architecture. The title comes from Aby Warburg's concept of Bilderfahrzeuge, or image vehicles, and offers a pioneering study of the importance of architecture to Warburg and his institute, an institute that, of course, looms very large across the hall in art history, where I work, but which has also left an important imprint in our field. I'll speak as our, being in the School of Architecture today. In Tim's analysis, Warburg's libraries are not static containers that hold books and prints. They are really vehicles that enable the transmission and study of the emotive potency that images carry, and I think that's crucial. Tim's scholarship stretches across a very wide range of periods and topics, from 16th century Italy with a study of the Vatican obelisk, to 18th century interiors and naval architecture, to the bold traffic planning that transformed Stockholm at the beginning of the 20th century, and we're going to hear more about that tonight. Much of these interests have been brought together in his most recent book, Things That Move, A Hinterland in Architectural History. And what connects these seemingly disparate things is a concern for architecture's enduring, essential, and often repressed relationship with movement. And if I could just pull one thought from the book to sit with and appreciate, it would be Tim's assertion that questions of movement are neither a modern addition to architecture, nor something simply contained by architecture, nor something secondary to architecture's preoccupation with structure, solidity, or permanence. Movement has been an imminent part of the ways that architectural thinking and doing have been going on all the way back to Vitruvius. Movement, as he writes in the introduction, is as equally architectural as stasis. Questions concerning mobility have contributed to the material intelligence that our field has developed over centuries, yet it's an intelligence that's often been relegated to the field's hinterlands, as his subtitle suggests. And as his research shows, these outskirts are ripe for reappraisal and reassessment. There is so much to be found there. And for all these reasons, I'm really grateful to Tim for sharing his work with us today and for providing a keynote to the symposium. So with that, please help me welcome Tim Anstey to the podium.
Thank you for that extremely complimentary introduction, and thank you, Dean, for the earlier words. At the lecture at the Warburg Institute, I told them that the title of the lecture was The Tenant's Furniture, and the title came up as The Tenant's Future. And I realised I've actually done the same thing, Discrepant Circulations. Maybe it could be both. What I'll do today is I will talk a little bit, as Craig said, in relationship to this book, and particularly about the last chapter. And it's a kind of shaggy dog story. I will pitch into it, but I think, and I hope, that some of the issues, at least, that came out in Craig's incredibly well-formulated introduction are there latently or tacitly. Okay, here goes. Stockholm, do you hear me? Stockholm just got a new bridge. Fabricated from steel in China, it journeyed to the Baltic from the port city of Qinhuangdao in early 2020 aboard the self-submersible heavy-load carrier Zhenhua 33. Having navigated the Indian Ocean, Suez Canal, the Mediterranean, Zhenhua spent a month off the coast of Portugal waiting to continue her journey north. An intense series of storms, characteristic of the worst predictions of climate change, produced huge swells that barred her progress. Ship and bridge pursued a zigzag trail, circling as Zhenhua's captain gauged the safest moment to head north. Here you see the bridge as it came into the strait, into the Baltic Sea. The fabrication of the bridge and the long journey from China were necessitated by the removal of one of the most curious architectural monuments produced during Sweden's period as a 20th century social democratic welfare state. The Golden Bridge replaces a complex that solved problems of traffic congestion at a place called Slussen in Stockholm. In 1935, when this structure was inaugurated, its uncompromisingly machine-like aesthetics were advertised as a plus. 50 years later, it had become, in the eyes of the city government, an eyesore. In 2015, demolition cranes moved in, the site was cleared, and the new bridge ordered. What I want to do this evening is to try to unfold something about that vanished construction, the strange eel-like assembly you see on the screen here, to express what was lost, and to advocate for its importance, and to suggest, maybe, some aspects of the discrepant and the circular. This is our theme. In the debates that preceded its demolition, Slussen was identified as an early type of highway interchange, an ancestor to structures like the Santa Monica-San Diego freeway that Reyna Banham would famously later love in Los Angeles. But the formal resemblances on which this identification was based were to some extent quite accidental. Although contemporaneous with the earliest split-level road systems built in the US, at Woodbridge in New Jersey, the project in Stockholm had a different raison d'etre from the automobile examples that were built in Germany and in USA in the next few years. Slussen was developed not as an infrastructural device, but as an urban set piece full of offices, shops, kiosks and restaurants, as well as platforms, traffic ramps and lifts. Three protagonists created this proposal. Yngve Larsson, born in 1881, was the city mayor for infrastructure. Tage William Olsen, born in 1889, was recruited as the architect based on his previous visionary planning projects for the city. Gustav Gösta Lundborg, born in 1898, and these are important dates, was the consulting engineer for the city building office. All three had spent formative periods of their young lives in Stockholm, a period during which motive technologies completely changed the way the city was encountered. Just after 1900, like many other places, Stockholm began to electrify its main system of urban transport. Trams. They ranged out into the countryside on dedicated rails and mixed freely with other traffic in the city centre. They were quick. They made you wait. They created moments of pause at particular points. And the change emphasised an urban condition that contrasted immersive experience in the street with a new sense of observation obtained within the glazed, fast-moving interiors of the tramcars themselves. As in other cities, a slight doubling in which inhabitants could see themselves, alternatively as actors and spectators, was repeated in venues of consumption that this new system of urban translation served. Downtown, new stores, Nordiska Kompaniet and Centrum. From 1891, an open-air museum. Skansen moved vernacular buildings from the Swedish regions to the newly urbanized city. The stars, by the way, are the things that reveal where things are. By 1909, Stockholm's first fun fair, Gröna Lund, that's the Green Grove in English, was offering elaborate experience rides. Stockholmers shopped, role-played at being farmers, and rode the Brooklyn Cakewalk, the Zeppelin Carousel. Such venues encouraged a new sense of identity. To be here was to be in several places at once, high in the air and down on the ground, in the city and simultaneously part of a rural scene, on stage and in the audience. Just to say, this wasn't paradise. This is a slide from the Open Air Museum, Skansen, 1890. They also displayed Sami families, so it wasn't, much better then, but anyway. This kind of experience was endemic for urban societies at the start of the 20th century, but the weft that wove a commonality in the international experience of the urban came through the development of moving film. In addition to all the stimuli provided by electric transport, developing pleasure parks, and the development of commercial venues, the designers of Slussen lived through a period in which cinema reconfigured the experience of urbanity, and the mechanism of the movie camera began to imprint liveliness in big cities onto collective memory. The juxtaposition of movement and stasis that early films provided for urban audiences played out in two genres. Cameras stationed at fixed points recorded urban patterns that are extraordinary still to watch. A cyclist swerves to avoid a dray, horses' heads toss, a motorist squeezes in front of an omnibus. As well as recording city movement from a stationary point, early films often created phantom rides, where the camera reproduced the subjective experience of a passenger travelling on a moving vehicle. Like fixed point shooting, tracking shots were used to record familiar scenes. Such films caught the previously indescribable teeming quality of early 20th century urban space and offered up its ingredients for analysis. At the same time, they caught a condition of being moved through this space in an apparently unbroken flow, as if one was at once both part of and isolated from the scene simultaneously. This is a must. Google this film. Extraordinary. Stockholm had a special place in this cinematic development, one which was maintained through the years in which Slussen's three designers grew to adulthood. In the first years of the 20th century, the city's many cinematographers made panning compositions recording quaysides and bridges and phantom rides that travelled its tram routes. The habit of presenting Stockholm on film continued through the 1920s and 1930s, where the narrative fantasy of the main feature shown in Stockholm's cinemas was usually preceded by locally focused newsreels. These might record seasonal attractions, like the museum at Skansen, experience rides in Stockholm's fairgrounds, or the grander events for which the city formed a backdrop, all on film. They even recorded the architectural development of the city's own apparatus of cinematic display. And this is something unusual that's worth a word. Let's look at Flamman, a flagship picture house completed in Stockholm in 1930. Buildings like this were key cultural venues in the film-obsessed city, celebrated across media. For the opening of the cinema, that's its inauguration night, the the Swedish film industry, who owned the building, released a newsreel that was played as part of the first programme in the cinema, amid an orchestral performance and lots of involvement of living actors from the time. The movie began, as you see, with shots of the new building under construction, followed by scenes showing the urban context from which it sprang. People sat in the newly opened auditorium and met, on screen, a compressed history of the city quarter they had just left to enter the building, its landmarks recognisable, but its morphology suddenly fluid, flickering before their eyes. To me, this is extraordinary. So back to Slussen. In 1929, Larsen, Lundberg, and William Olsen became executive agents for a city commission to address traffic in central Stockholm. So the site was right here by the cross. This point, you see it. The water system that makes the archipelago crosses a series of city islands, and traffic flowing north to south, as you can see on the red and blue lines, was squeezed and interrupted by a busy seaway travelling east-west through the opening bridges. This place was a focal point in the flickering shadow of Stockholm portrayed on camera during the earlier 20th century. It included a central space, Karl Johans Torg, or Karl Johans Square, in which the effects of mixed traffic could be seen, and a giant public elevator constructed by a Belgian firm of ironworkers in 1883 to connect the waterside level of the docks with the high ground on the city's southern island behind, providing a viewing platform for spectators. Because of its spectacular qualities, Slussen attracted cinematic record. It figured in phantom rides aboard the city's trams. Film captured the trip up the Katarina elevator and the panoramic views of the city revealed in the ascent. What people came to see, as well as panoramic views, was a circulatory bottleneck. Traffic increased during the first decade of the 20th century. The mixture of vehicles and pedestrians became steadily denser. The congestion worsened. During the second decade of the 1900s, as more powerful electric motors allowed longer assemblies of trams. In 1921, extra pressure was put on the system when the tram lines in the north and the south of the city were joined. And throughout the period, the venue became more popular with cameramen. By the 1930s, Slussen was acknowledged as the darling location for the city's photographers. Indeed, this identity was eventually inscribed into the very structure that dominated the site. The Katarina elevator from 1930, this is the same one that was built in 1888, before the rebuilding of the site, was crowned by a sign advertising fresh fill. You see it. Erected by the Numa Petterssons Handels och Fabriksaktiebolag. You don't need to really worry about what that means in Swedish. Suffice to say that they're a central actor in 20th century cinema in Sweden. They provide developing and they own the license for Pathé News films. Moving film was key for the design team analysing and describing this situation. When they presented their proposals in the magazine Tekniska Tidskrift, they adopted a photograph taken at high level, looking directly south of the central square that was the epicentre of the traffic problem. This was not a view that was publicly available. It required access to a private roof, but it was a view familiar from cinema, identical to one used in a well-publicised 1928 short film showing traffic in the area. So this is what was being shown in the cinema before the main feature when the designers were working on the problem. People in Stockholm around 1930 went to the movies around once a week. There were certainly over 100 large cinemas in the city. So it was a very major part of their experience at this time. Where still photography eloquently showed the knot of trams that created many of the traffic problems the designers addressed, film vividly showed how this knot formed and dissolved through time. The designs to regulate Sluisen sought to move this sense of movement back into the real. Lundborg and William Olsen, the designers, made a first-order spatial reorganization that folded the continuous ground plane of the site, on which trams and motor traffic met, onto a number of interconnected levels. Between 1929 and 1931, William Olsen produced a series of plans of the system. In all of them, as in early cinema, traffic is treated as spectacle, and architecture is used to promote this spectacular quality, providing multiple locations from which the scene could be seen. As Sluisen's design matured from 1930 to 1934, the mechanisms that permitted film's descriptive potential began to inform cultural production at many contexts. Mies van der Rohe's glass skyscraper project, we all know well, whose undulating, translucent facades and wafer-thin floors were spread in images throughout the 1920s, incorporated a set of sprocket holes into the attic, suggesting a fluidity of movement in its facades equal to that provided by celluloid. Buster Keaton's Sherlock Jr. from 1924 turned audiences' attention specifically to the celluloid movie reel with its strips of black and white transparencies and the mysterious way in which it recorded time. By 1934, the same rich associative potential was emerging in native filmic productions aimed at Swedish audiences. The emotive and technical aspects of cinema overlap in Swedish film industry's Farden ut i världen, Swedish film out and about, they're great titles, shown in almost all Swedish picture houses that year. The journey commences with a group of narrators sitting around a great barrel that spews celluloid strips, and it continues with a detailed filmic history of the movie camera, including an extended passage showing the internal workings of the Swedish film industry machine used to make the recording. Whilst Sluisen's site was constructed through film, the proposals for its design were evolved in a context in which the technologies that constructed film were themselves being dramatized and made available as information. In their very careful analysis of the conditions of transport in Stockholm, Larsen Lundborg and William Olsen saw the traffic chaos of Sluisen in terms that strongly parallel the sensibilities emerging in film. That it might be possible to order a heterogeneous collection of experiences into a design sequence, and that through technical design, an appearance of flow could be created out of a reality that included jerky stop motion. The spiral ramps that identified Sluisen with the development of the motorway intersection emerged as the designers investigated how to accommodate the variety of routes that motor traffic had to make in circulating around the trams. Sluisen's designers gave a filmic twist to this reclassification, where the trams were marked by the continuous trace of their tracks. The lines of other traffic were represented as a series of closely linked discrete packages, hurrying along one behind the other. There you see them at the top. Each quasi-vehicle identified with a black indented rectangular frame with a smaller oblong inside it, closely followed by its identical neighbours. At its opening in 1935, Sluisen was celebrated with a newsreel film, which presented the site's history and explained the new design using spliced sequences from early urban movies in a composition that reached every Swedish film industry cinema in the land. The film's cinematography resonates with the design sensibility of Sluisen as built, and it employed a similar strategy to that used in the inaugural newsreel shown at the opening of the Flammen Cinema in Stockholm that we just talked about. The action begins with a spectacular flyover of shot of Sluisen, setting the new project into the context of the city. But we'll join it 2 minutes in when, to break away, are we running? Sorry. when, to break away from the present and into the history of the site, the gaze of the camera moves aloft in a tracking shot that uses the Caterina lift shaft as its vehicle. The ascent is shot in the new Caterina elevator and a subsequent tracking descent in the original lift that was demolished to make way for it, observed in a film from 1922. The next 4.5 minutes provide a retrospective of Slusen's history, spliced together from films of varying vintage to show how Stockholm's cameramen recorded their favourite location over time. Following this, an iris in, as it's called, dissolve, brings in a new theme, illustrating the pressing traffic problems that Slusen solved, while a final similar dissolve heralds the presentation of the current organisation. The first iris in, creating a new sense of rotating urgency, introduces the immersive experience of the site during the late 1920s. Pedestrians sprint last minute over opening bridges, traffic moves at double speed, hurrying feet and wheels are shown close up. And the second iris dissolve whirls the narrative back to the present and connects in an absolutely explicit way filmic rotary motion to the solution of organising traffic through a similar orbit. The space made here is complex. This film was made after the design of Slusen was complete as part of the celebration to inaugurate the new traffic machine, as it was known. It presents all the confused contents of this piece of city, cars and kings, bicycles and barrows, trams and trucks, bridges, people and trains, and orchestrates these into one coherent narrative. The technique used, beginning and ending with a new construction, providing a microhistory of its locality through archive footage, is identical to that used in the newsreels that anchored Stockholm's new cinemas to the emotional fabric of the city, Flamman, as we saw earlier. And fascinatingly, the infrastructure of the film relates concretely to the architectural design of the site. The vertical movement created by the new Caterina elevator and the emblem of spinning rotation created by the new ramps are both built into the narrative structure of the film. Let's think a little more about the apparatus at the Flamman Cinema from 1930 that links its architecture and the filmic record. When people sat in that building watching a film that featured the building they were sitting in, a subtle join was created between the audience and the flickering world on screen. This link then proceeded towards whatever time or chronology that the world of film chose to invent. For the inauguration at Flamman, the newsreel film about the building was followed immediately by the Swedish premiere of Douglas Fairbanks' 1929, The Iron Mask. You didn't have to leave your seat between the newsreel and the main feature immediately afterwards. Sven Svensson, moving away from the camera over the bridge, met Douglas Fairbanks jumping towards the camera through the carriage of Cardinal Richelieu. It made an extraordinary link between two worlds, one immediate, the other removed and wishful. In Stockholm, this mechanism applied not only to the heterotopic spaces of the cinema, but to everyday problems of city circulation. Urban commuter transport systems are often thought of as concerned with the donut of working experience rather than the whole of dreamlike possibility. Yet in the Scandinavian welfare state, a rationalist composition of ramps and bridges to solve traffic problems also contained an element of pure fantasy. So in the last part of this talk, I'll try and contextualize and draw conclusions from that link, which was as extraordinary as the one created at Flamman. The inaugural film for Slusen closes with a toast made inside Gondolen, a restaurant slung under a bridge high above the rotating trams. As the king holds his champagne glass, autumn afternoon sunshine pours through the windows of the restaurant, making a silhouette of the city behind. He's standing in a room constructed within the truss that supported a pedestrian bridge stretching out from the tower of the Katarina elevator, which stood in the middle of the project. The details of how this structure came to be constructed need not detain us here. What is important is the embodied experience that was being created by the architecture of the site, regardless of its authorship, and its relationship to something outside the everyday. In its naming and in its architectural expression, Gondolen identified Sluisen with the most exclusive form of transport that the early 1930s had to offer, travel by airship. Before 1935, the year in which Sluisen opened and the year in which the LZ Hindenburg exploded in the air as it touched down outside New York, airships embodied a future whose horizons seemed infinite. Worldwide, lighter than air travel, explored by the British Imperial Airship Programme, was achieved when the German Graf Zeppelin circumnavigated the globe in 1929. The possibilities of these weirdly beautiful machines was vibrant in the European architectural imaginary during the early 1930s. So this is Gio Ponti's room, Il più leggero, the most light, at the Milan Triennale. The conceit of airship identity was carried very far in the design of Gondolen. Its lightweight cane furniture closely resembled the chairs and tables of the British airship R101. The model for the interior appears to have been the passenger lounge of the Zeppelin's LZ-129, images of which were in circulation after 1930. The sloping glazed curtain walling and the slanting roof in Gondolen are uncannily close to Fritz August Bernson's and César Pinar's drawings for the airship. Larsson, Lundberg, and William Olsen's traffic interchange thus articulated journeys with an extraordinary breadth of destination. For Stockholm's commuters, the reorganization of the tram system was advertised to cut the time to reach the centre of the city from the southern suburbs from 15 minutes to 9. The LZ-129, christened Hindenburg for her maiden voyage in 1936, advertised the possibility of travelling from northern Germany to New York in 2.5 days, to Rio de Janeiro in 4. Like the movie houses playing films across the city, Gondolen moved its occupants virtually out of the everyday Stockholm, collapsing distances like a telescope. I feel like I'm compressing air into this lecture like an airship, and it may crash and burn. But despite the risk, there's one more aspect I'm going to mention that connects to this curious mixture of the everyday, the fantasy, and the kinetic that I'm suggesting informed architecture in Between the Wars Stockholm. Curiously, this invocation of luxury travel made in Gondolen, in the restaurant Gondolen, also embraced a local kinetic memory. That is to say, at the same time as it projected an imaginary future, it made present a lost past. In 1919, Axel Eliasson, a firm of photographers famous for producing postcards of the city's landmarks, manufactured an image portraying the first long-range Zeppelin, LZ Bodensee, hovering over the site where the Gondolen restaurant was later to be moored. Although the postcard in itself was a photomontage, the event it recorded was real. Bodensee had visited Stockholm in October 1919 and made a tour above the towers and landmarks of the city. It's very nice. This here says real photography in Swedish. The photomontaged, artificially created Bodensee conjured up a second precursor to Gondolen, one that brought the fantasy the restaurant projected much nearer to problems of urban engineering, to the material reality of city commuting and to the earthbound mechanics of the electrified automotive tramway. In Stockholm, a lot of leisure events revolved around the deer park, we would call it. This space up here, the city's main park. It was here that the Bodensee landed, carrying memories that connected immersive, translative experience with distant geographies. In the park, topoi were created, almost always involving the mechanics of film record, that collapsed the distance separating Sweden from the rest of the world. Sometimes these were fictional, sometimes they were briefly real. From 1900, spectators could travel back in time at Skansen, transported to the museum's site above the park by a funicular railway. You see it on the left. The 1909 Art and Industry exhibition offered visitors a helter-skelter and a gravity log flume. And the fairground, that this was kind of a precursor of, had a Paris wheel, Hollywood cars, Babylon, and various other mechanical rides. To be in the Deer Park, this space in the city, was thus to occupy different realities, urban and rural, and different times, future and past, and different places, from Paris to Hollywood to Babylon. The site at Slussen, where William Olsson, Lundborg, and Larsson projected a new elevator, had a pre-existing connection to this atmosphere of a venue that defined the pleasure park. On January the 18th, 1912, Fritjof Malmsten and his brother Helge balanced head on head atop the tower of the Katarina elevator, with Fritjof mounted on his bicycle. The two were caught in their turn on camera, a show as daring as anything audiences could imagine in a playground. We have to watch all of this. I don't know the make of bicycle. The redesigned Katarina elevator that replaced the one in which Fritjof and Helge balanced also identified with the spatial ambivalence of its cousins, the fairground, and the open-air museum. In its 1930s incarnation, which exaggerated slimness and emphasized the panoramic views that could be gained from the lift tower, the elevator came close to providing experiences available at the Green Grove Fairground. Gondolen, the airship eatery, then makes a final reference to this mental twinning of traffic hub and recreational venue. The restaurant is evocative of an airship, yes, but of an airship mediated using the mechanical contraptions that made up the experience of fantasy travel in the local urban realm. By the time it was constructed, the Zeppelin carousel at the Green Grove Fairground had been superseded by other more advanced rides. But Gondolen played in an economy of experience that was aligned with such structures, combining pay-to-enter lift access and contrived experience. What kind of place was being constructed here, midway through the 1930s, just before the explosion of the Hindenburg and halfway between the catastrophic financial crash of 1929 and the systemic war that commenced in 1939-40? Fairgrounds and movie theatres tend to be read as places of excess, locations where time is seen as a commodity to be purchased, where surplus capital can be squandered. Urban transport systems, on the other hand, are places where time is seen as a cost to be saved, where spending occurs only in the interest of a greater saving. If a good fairground connotes excess, a good transport system connotes thrift. The lesson of Slussen, a design produced in a socialist welfare state, appears to be different. Here, bodily and individual experience are regarded as a kind of capital. The production of such experience through works of kinetic engineering is given value, and the whole, apparently, can be charged with some mnemonic potential that makes sense of the city. The city could not become an airship, but it could become a fun fair, in the best sense, a place that provided pleasure and equity, a dream factory based on human-scale actions of suspension and removal. This is the charm of Sluisen as completed in 1935 with its movie camera ramps and its crazy skyline restaurant. We live in dark times. The Golden Bridge in Stockholm, which I began with, arrived in the middle of the COVID pandemic, and the crew of the Zenhua 33 did not disembark. City propaganda motivated the decision to remove the 1935 Sluisen project with an assertion that we would reclaim Sluisen as a place for human meetings. From traffic junction to meeting place, ran the slogan. But while the virtual possibility of lighter-than-air flight evoked at Sluisen in 1935 still appears inspiring and indeed futuristic, the intercontinental transfer of thousands of tons of steel to form that structure's replacement appeared, even as the bridge approached Stockholm, problematic and outdated. Sluisen never was simply a traffic junction. Neither was it a single destination, with its references to kinetic memory, to fun fairs, to pleasure parks, and to film. It spoke of a new and still contemporary notion of architectural place as multiple, a vehicular construction in which the logic of a single spatial identity is questioned, and in which the duality of a here-ness and a there-ness is inbuilt. All this using means that were local rather than global, ephemeral as well as material. In 2025, as in 1935, this last possibility seems important to celebrate at all levels, architectural, political, and cultural. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Take some questions?
Yeah, of course. If there are any questions, I'm very happy to take a question.
Comments?
There are never any questions.
Maybe I will offer something up just to get things going while people are thinking about their questions. I was extraordinarily taken by your talk, and I couldn't help but think of the paradox that we see within it. And first of all, I want to just thank you for reminding us about the important connection between infrastructure and fantasy. We just have lost that in so many ways. And the infrastructure is not only something that stands under, but something that involves meeting and meeting across differences. But there's a tremendous paradox that the desire to produce flow actually articulates difference. And this is sort of one of the ideas of the common. So to make the traffic flow, to clean up the mess, you need to move things onto different levels. You need to separate them to create discrepancies and differences. And I'm wondering to what extent the creators were aware of that problem, that the creating of difference was itself going to fragment the public of Stockholm, and responded to that through this particular, fantastic design that you've laid out for us. Is it compensatory in a way, this sort of fantasy that's produced, in order to counteract the production of difference?
God, what a difficult question. I think one thing about Stockholm, one thing that's interesting about the cities, the urban development of Scandinavia is that it's very late. And it has therefore a slightly bizarre overlap between certain evolving technologies. So the people in Sweden becomes an industrial city around 1900. So there's a vast number of people moving into the city, and they have very strong identification with their locality that they have moved from. So the reason Stockholm has an open-air museum so early is that it's a way of maintaining your difference. So you're part of the flow, but you're also constantly somewhere else. And in that sense, I think everyone in Stockholm was very aware, but perhaps everywhere, of course, it doesn't seem so very unusual. So, and that's not an answer to the question, but it seems to me that I think people were, from what I've understood, certainly in things like the technology of film, people were incredibly aware of what was going on, what the mechanisms were doing. Both in the sense that they were very interested in the mechanisms themselves, which film, of course, is the absolute mechanism that, to make a film, you have to cut reality to bits, and you have to create disjunction, and then you exhibit in a way which looks like a flow. And that little film clip I showed, and the discourse around the 1920s suggests that people were acutely aware of this. Whether they kind of made us a societal reading of that, I don't know. I mean, it's still... And I think that's very interesting that we can see now Stockholm, we would say, a very homogeneous society. Everyone was from Sweden, right? They were all white, they were all Caucasian, they were all from Sweden. But I think for the people in Sweden, they did not conceive themselves as a very homogeneous society in 1930. They thought, well, he's from Dalarna and he is from Skåne. And so I think it's very different. But certainly, I guess also it's interesting that it's a welfare state model. And of course, lately we've critiqued the welfare state model specifically because it works in a homogeneous society like Sweden, and it falls apart when people come from the outside. But actually, if you look at the situation in which it's created, it is a situation where people are coming from the outside. They're just not coming quite so far. So I think we should give them some credit for certain of that. And at the same time, the Sami picture means there are things that were just complete blind spots that you could go and have a gawp at a family from Lapland without sort of batting an eyelid.
Yeah. You have mic? Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I have your most recent book. I'm looking at it because I'm also interested in regulations in the U.S. surrounding permanency and indigenous architecture. And so I was really intrigued by the photograph that you have, the Sami structure. And I'm actually really wondering about where that was sourced, because that structure is not, a traditional Sami structure. And I think there's a lot more to that story that you didn't touch on. And so I was wondering if you could expand on that.
Well, actually, I really can't, because I found that photograph while I was preparing this lecture, so I'd like you got me. But the context that the picture's taken in is in this open-air museum, which is an extraordinary and very modernistic construction, but it is made up of indigenous buildings taken from different parts of Sweden. And of course, the interesting thing is, to us, there's a huge difference between taking an indigenous building as part of the Sami population and taking a farm from northern Sweden and from southern Sweden. And so I can undertake to find out the background. I think you're absolutely right that it's much more. All of Skansen is a very odd stage set, but this is a stage set where the whole Skansen thing is you could be in the set or you could be outside, right? It's like your parents' farm, so you could sort of jump from one to the other. And this is clearly something else and akin to the exhibition. So, the 1890 World Paris exhibition has a kind of whole Japanese village. I think it was in that and contemporary with that tradition. And of course, Skansen is also a zoo of the exotic. I mean, you could see tigers and lions. So you have a whole group of us who are kind of categorized differently at that point without, I suspect, anybody being even reflected on the fact that that was an issue. But it's interesting you say that, because I sort of guessed it doesn't look to me like a very indigenous Sami building either. I don't know, but I was interested you said that.
Yeah, and it's written within the context of movement. They are placing this interpretation of traditional structure on top of a foundation in order to
Absolutely.
Really emphasize stability, stationary.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And so that's why I thought it was really interesting.
Yeah, and the other backstory that's very fascinating is that Stockholm is electrified in 1905, partly for geopolitical reasons, because they and certainly during the First World War, they understand they don't have coal, so that there was a real, it was very bad in Sweden in the First World War because they didn't have any coal, because the coal came from Germany. And hydroelectric power was a sort of defense mechanism. Hydroelectric power requires the annexation of Sami land. So there's a whole story of connection, which goes on to this day, of contested environments to do with the generation of power, powering lovely, clean, modernist Sweden. So there is that history too. That photograph is from earlier than that. I think it predates the first hydroelectric. Maybe not quite, but it's the very beginning. But I think you're right. I think there was a great drive to kind of fix things down as well. So yes, I wouldn't suggest they were sort of, anything other than that. Super interesting though. So that's a good thing to carry on researching. One thing aside is, in some places it's nicer to do research than others. It's incredibly nice to do research in Sweden because all this stuff is online. So, and most of the things are translated, so it's incredibly easy to search regardless of who you are. So if you want to go ahead, they're really good at, that's one thing I think they do really well. They put the stuff out there and it's free to get to.
Yep. I usually don't ask questions at lectures, but I was so... Sorry, I usually don't ask questions at lectures, but I was so taken both by the story of the new bridge and the fact that we only saw the new bridge on a boat, which is, of course, amusing in and of itself. But I'm curious as to once the new bridge was installed, and you very intentionally have not shown us a picture of that, how scarred was the landscape from the removal of what was there before?
It depends whether in which dimension are we talking scarred. It's like, it's a deep emotion. Yes. Actually, the main thing, it's incredibly ugly. It's like, so basically, I think the use for the price for the best use of a Minecraft texture will go to that project. It's like unbelievably bad. It's a design by committee, and it's taken. So this project I'm talking about took 5 years from conception to building, and they've been arguing about the site for the past 30 years, and the project they're building has taken nearly 10 years to build. And of course it is difficult to build good projects now in a sort of society in which a lot of people have voices. So physically, I think they would, there's a lot of claims going about it making things better, that it's better for the water, it's better for the fish, it's better for this, it's better for that. So I guess there might be proponents saying that in terms of scarring of the landscape, it's not so bad. I wouldn't really call it a scar in the city. And, number of people who are really worried about the fact that they've taken away this. There was a big preservation debate about it. I mean, there was a big camps in that debate. But mostly it's just incredibly bad. I mean, it's like, it's like the proof that you can do things badly. And that's very sad, because it could have been incredibly good, of course. And everyone kept saying it might be really good. And they carried on saying this for like 10 years, and it's really bad.
Thanks for a really beautifully presented lecture. Did Susan enjoy a long golden age that could potentially have continued indefinitely, or were the seeds of its
destruction in the
present?
Depends who you are. It depends, as everything else these days. It depends who you ask. But there was, I think, there was a problem that it was sinking, and the trackway wasn't sinking with the trains on, but the bit above was sinking. So the gap for the trains to go through was getting smaller. So I think to keep it, they would have had to do a very big project of underpinning. But that's been done. So, of course, I think if it had gone the other way, it could have easily been a preservation project. But it would have needed a lot of, it would be a bit like the cathedral at Noto, they'd have had to really, really rebuild it. So it had, yes, I mean, it's a steel and concrete building in a bad climate. So it it was in quite a ropey condition. But they stopped renovating. I mean, there was also a kind of political decision to stop trying to renovate, to stop maintaining it. So it became much, much, much more ropey than it otherwise might have been because of political decisions about what to do. Yeah, that's what I would say. And there were no trams on it as well. They did very interesting things. They changed which side of the road they drove on after they built it, which is, you wouldn't think would be possible, would you? That you build a motorway station, junction, and then they changed to the other side of the road. But it all worked backwards, like a film going backwards. So very smart.
Yes, we have one.
Exquisite lecture, thank you so much. Just a quick question about in a sense it's a technical question, about the speed at which film was played, Buster Keaton was played, and the speed of traffic, and the kind of isomorphism, in a sense the role of velocity in all of this.
Yeah.
The pace of the film and the pace of traffic going through a dense urban area.
I think that's a really good question, because I kind of assume it's very quick, but I suspect it's very slow. So I talk about the melee of the early 20th century in Stockholm, that there's no people. There are no people, there's one tram going really slowly. I think, what do I think? The slide with the 4 films, which has this very famous film from San Francisco with the streetcar moving into the perspective, and you know that film is filmed 4 days before the big San Francisco earthquake, and the negatives only were saved because they were on the train back to being developed in the West Coast, on the East Coast. So that vehicle is moving very slowly. It's moving just a bit quicker than walking speed, but you still get this kind of effect. So I think it's not about high velocity, and Slusen is all at the speed of a tram, which I say they're fast, but they're going at 9-10 miles an hour maybe. But I guess if you fall off one, it feels quick, as always, doesn't it? And you could jump on and off without, when it was moving. So I think I don't have a really good answer to your question, but I think a lot of those films you feel like it's also about an inevitability of advance. It cannot be stopped. It's a very big thing advancing, and it may be advancing at a bit quicker than you can walk. But the main thing is it's just going to carry on going. I don't know that's not really velocity. I don't know what you would call that. Insistence. And that seems to be important. In all of those films that you see, this sort of ongoing thing. Yeah. Yes. Okay.